Hello, and welcome back to a brand new day of free-to-play on Magic the Gathering Arena. Get the dish on the latest with me, Lord Rumfish. Today we are diving back into the Deckbuilding Toolbox. We are going into blue. The purpose of this guide is to give you, the viewer, even if you're not a free-to-play account, you want to be careful with your wild cards. The idea is to give you a toolbox to build up a collection that you can craft multiple different deck archetypes with. Alright, so that being said, an offer you can't refuse. This uncommon is like a 1-mana negate, gives the controller 2 treasures. I don't think you want to double up on this effect too much in your deck. It can backfire spectacularly to give the opponent treasure. On the other hand, you can use it if you go into full control, right? Hit the control key or put a stop on the current phase of the turn, and you can counter your own spell to get the 2 treasures. Most of the time you don't want to do that, but there could be occasions when you do. I think it's a pretty decent one-of. Combat Research. So this card can be good in multiples. I have to be a little sparing with my common and uncommon wildcards. I'm going to do 6 commons and 8 uncommons today. I still need to get through the other colors and multicolor. Multiple combat research is fine. If you have a tempo deck that you're doing, you could put it onto an evasive threat such as Stormchaser Drake. And not only will you draw a card when you target the Stormchaser Drake, now it will start drawing you cards when it deals combat damage. Overall, this is a playable card. Depending on whether you like that style of deck or not, depends on whether you want to craft it or not. Consider this is a rock-solid early game filler card. Helps smooth out your draws. Surveilling into the graveyard can help other types of themes. For example, it makes Tolarian Terror cheaper to cast. Bulks up the power of the Haughty Djinn, which we'll get to in Rares and Mythics. Being 1 mana in a mono blue deck, or a deck that can easily hit blue mana in the early turns, consider it a good card. You may already have 4 copies of it. Delver of Secrets. So I'm not 100% convinced on Delver of Secrets. Some people run it in their blue tempo lists and some people do not. I think it's fine. And being an uncommon, if you can't spare the rares for the Haughty Djinn does come in one of the packets in Jump In. I think it might be Arcanists. But if you're trying to preserve your rare wildcards, you could do Delver of Secrets, Tolarian Terror, and just build out your threats with commons and uncommons. That would be an extremely budget deck of mono blue. So it's an option. Fading Hope, you might already have it. I think 2 copies would be about the right craft to just have access to this 1 mana answer in blue. It's more of a tempo answer than a permanent answer, so beware of running 4 copies in your deck and relying on it. Still, I think it's good enough in decks where it's one of the ways you can save Stormchaser Drake. Usually you want to keep it on the battlefield, but sometimes having a versatile card like this where you can also take an opponent's threat off the table, can play offense and defense. It's decent as maybe a 2-of. Shore Up. So Shore Up is a way to keep your creature on the battlefield. This card is maybe not quite as good as Slip Out the Back. Slip Out the Back lets your creature dodge, sorcery speed sweepers. Whereas Shore Up doesn't do quite the same thing, but it does untap your creature so you can blow out a combat step by untapping your creature with Shore Up, if you're pretty sure you don't need to protect your creature from an opponent's trick. Overall, it's good. I think in a blue tempo deck, there's no reason you shouldn't have one copy. If you want multiple copies, it's up to you. Slip out the back. Probably the stronger card of the two. Phasing Out is incredibly powerful. It doesn't just stop one sorcery speed answer, it stops all of them. So of the two, this might be the one you want to go in on 4 copies of. Wash Away, this is a solid counterspell. Can occasionally be cast for 1 in Standard. It's great to have the 1 copy if you're interested in Historic Brawl, or if they ever make Commander illegal on Magic Arena. So, crafting the 1, I think it's just overall good addition to your collection. Witness Protection, the 1 copy, it's an answer in a mono blue deck. Playable in Standard, also quite good in Historic Brawl. Again, I think 1 copy is a good call. Syncopate. So there's going to be a big smattering of different counterspells that you see here, and the reason for that, back before they printed Cancel, Blue used to get amazing counterspells, ridiculously powerful counterspells. The counterspells it has now are not quite as much of a slam dunk, no-brainer kind of include in a deck. So since all the different counterspells answer different things at different mana values at different points in the game, I think it's good to have a wide variety rather than a depth of counterspells. So I think 1 copy of Syncopate is good to have in your deck. You can counter something on 2. If you and the opponent are kind of top decking, you're at parity. Now this late game can counter any 1 spell quite reliably. The problem is if they double spell. That's why it's hard to run this in multiples. A little chat. This card, it's good enough to see Standard play. It does not, really, at the moment. I think it's fine if you want to do a blue-based Aristocrats build. So just consider it. Bring the Ending. So Bring the Ending shares a lot in common with another 2-mana removal counter, Make Disappear. So both of them at their floor, right, their base rate, counter a spell unless its controller pays 2. Often that's good enough. In the early turns of the game, that will be good enough. Later, Bring the Ending needs Corrupted in order to hit any spell, and Make Disappear gets stronger if you sacrifice a creature with 1 or more power. They are both decent 2-mana counterspells. Make Disappear is going to rotate out of Standard in the fall. I think having access to both of them is potentially good. If you know you're going to make a poison deck, Bring the Ending is better. If you know you're going to have some little sacrifice fodder, Make Disappear might be better. They're kind of on par. Alright, Defabricate. There are enough artifacts and enchantments in Standard that you may well hit a target, even running this main deck. The second ability, to counter an activated or triggered ability, is very interesting. You can trip up the opponent in untold myriad ways with the second mode on Defabricate. You can counter the Enter the Battlefield trigger of something like Lauren or Titan of Industry. You can, let's see, activate or triggered ability. I believe you could counter a channel ability, like this Mirror Shell Crab, or the rare land cycle that channels. Defabricate's very interesting. Now again, it's a little bit narrow, but I think having the one copy is a great thing to have in your toolbox. Disdainful Stroke, again, different counter spells for different situations. I think one copy of Disdainful Stroke is sometimes what your deck wants. Essence Scatter. Creatures are one of the primary ways that decks win the game. Not always, though. And if you bulk up on too many Essence Scatters, you'll run headlong into a creatureless control deck full of planeswalkers. So, one copy of this is good. Experimental Augury. If you're doing a deck that uses counters in some way, including poison counters, this is a very interesting card. If you do not need to proliferate for any reason, then you should probably go with Impulse. Impulse is an old and powerful card. It's fair, but it's very good. It does not get you card advantage, but it gets you very powerful card selection. Looking at the top 4 and taking the best one for your situation is great. Impulse sees a lot of play in the blue tempo deck with Tolarian Terror, sometimes Delver of Secrets, Haughty Djinn. Impulse is kind of a key card there. I would say so as Consider. Make Disappear, we talked about. Negate. I think a one-of copy of Negate floating around in your blue deck, or even a multicolor deck that has access to blue. One copy of Negate is a great silver bullet to have. And if you only have the one and it's a dead draw in an aggro matchup, at least you won't be drawing multiples of Negate. So I think the one of it is a good call here. Planar Incision. This is a neat card. It triggers, enters the battlefield, and leaves the battlefield, I suppose, abilities. It's a flicker effect in blue. I feel like this card probably ought to be seeing more play than it does. It's very powerful. There are lots of things that are good to flicker, lots of creatures you would love to have come back with a +1 counter. Planar Incision is very strong. Consider crafting 1 or 2 copies of it. Prologue to Phyresis. So this is kind of one of the key cards of doing the blue-black poison deck, where it can potentially be creatureless. You need a few cards like this that just flat put a poison counter on the opponent. If you don't plan to poison them to death, obviously you don't want this card. Replacing itself with a draw. Ultimately, every deck ends up flooding out. I've mentioned this before. 40% of the cards in your deck are lands. If every card in your deck just had a single draw a card effect attached to it, over the long run, across a very long game, eventually even that deck would flood out. This card is not good enough to run unless you need the poison counter. Security Bypass. Makes a creature unblockable. Is good for a tempo deck. Gets a Connive when the creature connects. So you draw, discard, and if it's not a land, the creature gets a +1 counter. This card can kind of, with a good creature like Storm Chaser Drake, it's already hard to block. Now it's unblockable if it attacks alone. You can protect it with things like Shore Up and Slip Out the Back. It can snowball and run away and win the whole game by itself. So not bad. If this is the kind of deck you want, consider crafting some. Serum Snare. So this is a bounce spell that proliferates if the thing you bounced has mana value 3 or less. Can rescue your permanents as well as the bouncing the opponents. Storm Chaser Drake, already mentioned. This is a great tempo deck card. get it down early, start making some aggressive attacks. You can find ways to pump it up and save it. And every time you target it, not the opponent, just when you target it, you'll draw a card. It's good. Yeah, for a certain type of tempo deck, you'll want to craft all four. Distorted Curiosity. So, again, you probably don't want to craft this card unless you know you want to go for the poison counter deck. If you do, this can be 1 blue to draw 2 cards. That's amazing. If you're going to try to build that deck, this is a key component of it. Stern Lesson. This has definitely seen some standard play at the highest levels of competition. It filters cards for you, right? Draw 2, discard 1. So it kind of breaks even on card advantage, but it ramps you a mana as long as you can use it. If you followed along the crafting guide and started it colorless, like I did, you have things to use this Power Stone on. So definitely consider if you might want to craft some Stern Lessons. Thirst for Discovery. This is another key card that you see pop up in the blue tempo deck with Haughty Jin. You know, when you're monocolor, you can have all basics, and the likelihood of hitting a basic land to discard with this is very high. It makes this, as a draw spell, very powerful. Thirst for Knowledge. This is the lesser-known variant of Thirst for Discovery. You discard 2 unless you discard an artifact card. There are a lot of great artifacts in the format. And again, if you started the crafting guide at colorless, you might have an artifacty deck. So, worthy of your consideration. Dissipate. This is a great one-of counterspell to have in your blue deck. Some people go in for all 4 copies because they like exiling things, and can be relevant in the format to make sure something doesn't come back from the graveyard. Overall, it's just a solid, fair counterspell. Urtai Scorn. If you like the blue tempo deck, or if you like a traditional draw-go control, you will want probably the playset, all 4 copies of Urtai Scorn. Otherwise, I think you should have about 2 of them. The ability to cost 1 blue less if an opponent casts 2 or more spells this turn, that is a very common situation. And in fact, when you're trying to counter the opponent's spells, very often you'll find yourself a little bottlenecked on mana. When you're in the early turns, you're going through 4 mana, 5 mana, you're trying to control the board, keep the spells countered. Urtai Scorn dropping down to a 2 mana counterspell can be exactly what you need when the opponent leads with a spell they want to have countered first and then plays a second spell that they really don't want to have countered. Then you can drop the Urtai Scorn and get them. It's great. Reject Imperfection. So this is a proliferate counterspell if it was mana value 3 or less. You don't have to be just the poison deck to be using this, and having a 3 mana counterspell in your collection like this, a sort of a cancel, it's good in general. Sometimes the proliferate will come up even if you haven't built your deck to take advantage of it. A lot of things just end up having counters. In your blue deck, you could be running the rare land with charge counters, blows up everything with mana value equal to X. So this could proliferate onto something like one of your lands. It's just a useful tool. Urza's Rebuff. Again, here's another 3 mana, cancel type counterspell that has the modal option of tapping 2 creatures. Sometimes you need to make a tempo play to keep yourself alive and stay in the game. So, I think having one copy of Urza's Rebuff is a great counterspell to have access to in your collection. Maybe you want even more. Firmament Sage, I'm not convinced you should craft this card. It hasn't seen much standard play. The reason I'm going to talk about it here, the Celestus, I know from experience, is an incredibly powerful card, triggers all the time, even if you don't sink the 3 mana into the Celestus to force the day-night cycle to trip. This Firmament Sage is just card advantage when day-night flips. I've always felt that there could be a home for this card somewhere in Standard. If you're on a budget, and the opponent does not remove this, it will draw you plenty of cards. And don't ever let anyone tell you that dying to removal makes a card not worth playing. Now, unfortunately, the Firmament Sage dies to just about all removal that's run in Standard, with the exception of maybe Play with Fire, things like that. Just about all removal hits the Firmament Sage, which is a shame. But cards like Sheoldred die to removal too, technically speaking. And Sheoldred can run away and win you the game. Firmament Sage with card advantage can kind of do the same thing. It's a budget option, keep it in mind. Micromancer. This is an interesting card that's going to stay in Standard for a long time. It's not going to rotate in the fall. Tutor effects tend to be very powerful. Just within blue, we can already fetch up counter spells, card draw, removal, protection. Heck, it can even get Wash Away, which is a hard counter, because of the cleave cost. That's an interesting interaction. Micromancer fetching up Wash Aways as hard counters. That's interesting. Syncopate. Same goes for Syncopate. I think Wash Away is the stronger choice there, but you could do both. Micromancer can get sorceries as well. You know, some good sorceries include the green fight spell. There's a couple of those for 1 mana. Or Strangle in red. Or Micromancer could fetch up in black Cut Down. One of the best removal cards in Standard for its mana cost. This card has not found a home yet. It's going to be in Standard a long time, and it's an interesting budget option. Worth considering. Organ Order. I'm just putting this here because I ended up getting 4 copies. And if you are trying to build a budget deck, you're very early on in MTG Arena, this is a 3-power threat that draws you the best card out of the top 3 on your library. One way or another, it can keep you in the game. It can trade as a blocker, it can pressure a control deck with its power. This is just kind of a good filler card. You'll end up replacing it over time with better choices. So I don't think you need to go out of your way to craft this card. But early on, this could be great. Scattered Thoughts. This doesn't see a lot of main deck play in Standard. There are stronger card draw spells at rare, and we'll look at some of those. But if you're looking at a budget option for very powerful card draw at 4 mana, Scattered Thoughts looks at the top 4. You take the 2 best ones, put them in your hand, and then it puts the others in your graveyard, which also helps your strategy. Your deck can take advantage of this. Things like, again, Tolarian Terror, or the Haughty Djinn can take advantage of things going to your graveyard with Scattered Thoughts. This card, for being a common, is very powerful. It has as much selection at 4 mana as the front side of one of the rares we're going to look at. As far as a budget option goes, this is worth looking at. Okay, Tamio's completion. Blue removal effects are few and far between. It's worth looking at this, and I think the one-of copy will give you something good in your collection you could put into a historic Brawl deck. So, doesn't really see standard play. 4 mana, even at flash, is a bit too much investment for most people to remove something. It's good though. It's absolutely solid removal, and it's in blue. So, having 1 copy to have access to for Historic Brawl or, whatever you might be trying to do, I think that's good. Flow of Knowledge. This is a very powerful mono blue card. It's instant speed. In a mono blue deck, all islands draws you a ton of cards. Just a ton. Incredibly powerful with cards like Teferi, the Planeswalker. It's good enough to run. Some people actually use it in the blue tempo deck. Very solid, very powerful. I think you should craft a copy, maybe more than 1. Alright, I'm not going to tell you to craft Psychic Pickpocket, and you might have it anyway in your collection from Jump In or the decks that you start the game with. The reason I want to talk about this card is because it reminds me very much of a card called Multiple Choice from Strixhaven. So Multiple Choice did not see a lot of standard play, but it did see fringe standard play. It did pop up. You saw it from time to time. So it was blue and X. If X was 1, I believe you scry and draw a card. Like scry 1, draw a card. If X was 2, an opponent returns a creature they control to its owner's hand. I don't think you chose what the creature was, but it didn't target. If X is 3, you made a 4/4 creature. And if X was 5, you do all of the above. So if we take a look at Psychic Pickpocket here, if it connives and you discard a non-land card, it'll get a +1 counter, which would make it a 4/3 for 5, right? That's comparable to the 4/4 token you would have gotten from Multiple Choice. When it connives, you return a non-land permanent to its owner's hand. That's comparable to Multiple Choice, and it's better than the bounce effect that was on Multiple Choice. You can choose what to target. You can also target your own things, not just the opponent's. I was starting to brew around this and Meathook Massacre in Standard when about the time Meathook Massacre got banned. But you can see the appeal, right? Bounce the Meathook Massacre back to your hand. In current format, you could bounce the Eternal Wanderer back to your hand as a, -4 board sweeper, Psychic Pickpocket comes back to your hand. You've reset its loyalty. Do it all over again. In fact, the Emperor could use its +1 on the Psychic Pickpocket to get this creature's ETB triggers all over again. I know it's janky, I know it's 5 mana, but if... and as far as Multiple Choice, scry 1, draw a card, a Connive is not quite as powerful as scry 1, draw a card. But just overall, the whole package of this card is extremely, extremely similar to Multiple Choice. Multiple Choice had the modality of being cast for less mana, but overall, Psychic Pickpocket has things going for it. It's a fair Magic card. I think it's good. I think it's not quite good enough for Standard. But gosh, it's right on the cusp. Probably no one agrees with me. But that's my opinion. I'm not going to tell you to craft it. Solarian Terror. So if you are building this deck, right? If you are building the blue spell-based control tempo deck, you probably want all 4 copies of Tolarian Terror. The only reason I'm not going to craft 4 copies is because my wild cards are tight at the moment, and I need to get through all of the colors plus multicolored. So I'm just crafting the 1 today to show you my conviction in the card. I've sat across the table from it, lost to it plenty of times. It's very good. If you build this deck, you will not be disappointed. You'll pick up lots of wins on a tight budget. Mearshell Crab. I don't know that you want the full playset of this card. It's interesting that it can counter a spell or an ability. Has a little bit of that second part of Defabricate lurking in this. Plus, as a channel card, you're not casting a spell, so if you're in a counter war where things are piling up onto the stack, and your opponent gets down to their last 2 mana, thinking that they're going to counter your last counter, if your last counter is Mearshell Crab, they can't counter that, and then they can't pay for it, and then they lose the war on the stack. Unless their card was Defabricate. Anyway, I think having a couple copies of Mearshell Crab is fine. An artifact synergy deck, or a deck that pulls things back from the graveyard, such as with the green rare Shigeki. You can do a lot with this card. As a threat to win the game, you could do worse. It's a common. See, I think having 1 or 2 copies for its channel ability is pretty nice. Alright. 6 commons and 8 uncommons is about what I can spare right now. I'm gonna craft it. Alright, let's get into the blue, rare, and mythics. So, March of Swirling Mist. For the blue tempo decks I've been talking about, whether you're using the Storm Chaser Drake, whether you're using Haughty Jin, either way, 1 or 2 copies of March of Swirling Mist can be this amazing blowout of a trick. Prevents your opponent's crackback attack. Does a one-sided sweeper if they try something like Depopulate. There are just a lot of ways that this card can win you the game, but you don't necessarily want all 4 of them. You definitely like to have access to the 1, though. So it makes a great craft for that deck. Surge Engine. This is a nice little threat. Becomes unblockable almost immediately. So, switches straight from Defender to unblockable. Coming down on turn 2, it's entirely relevant against aggro. Because if you know that the aggro deck has got the tempo advantage on you, absolutely block and trade this away while it still has Defender. Be mana efficient. Do what you need to do. But this also goes well into its own aggro and mid-range decks. So, this card can wear a lot of hats. It'll do good work for you if you craft it. Ledger Shredder kind of changes the way the opponent plays the game after this gets on the battlefield if they're not able to remove it. Good for those tempo decks that I was talking about. You can keep this protected, win the game by itself, because it keeps growing with +1 counters from Connives. And both you and the opponent can potentially grow the Ledger Shredder. That's a good card. Malevolent Hermit. This is an oldie but a goodie. So this can give a control player fits. Drops down on turn 2, starts pressuring their life total. Can stop one of their important non-creature spells. pretty good at disrupting some tricks out of mid-range decks too. And then Disturb, where your non-creature spells can't be countered, that'll also give control decks fits. A lot of people have probably forgotten this card exists in Standard. It's still here, it's still good. If you craft it, it will be of use. Very serviceable. Spectral Adversary. So, kind of like the March of Swirling Mist, more mana intensive also is a threat unto itself. If you have one copy floating around in your blue deck, it will do good work for you. There are just so many ways that phasing things out, yours or the opponent's, can blow them out. Blue Sun's Twilight is one of the more fun new cards to talk about. So, this is kind of what you want out of a blue removal spell. Blue does have some spells that can deal with permanents or put them back into the owner's library. But taking control of the opponent's permanent is by far a better option. Now they probably have to 2-for-1 themselves to remove their own creature with a removal spell. And you might even 3-for-1 them if X is 5 or more. And you don't target a legend. If you target a legend, one of those is going to legend rule themselves. Overall, I think this card's pretty good. Against aggro, it's entirely possible you could take a creature that costs 1 mana that's giving you problems as early as 3 mana. And 4 mana is also not an unreasonable mark to hit against an aggro deck, and their 2 mana spells are an aggro deck's bread and butter. So if you take one of their 2 mana things, then that's great. A lot of times you'll be facing things with haste, but if you're up against something like the Soldier deck, you might be able to grab an untapped thing to block for you. Overall, I think Blue Sun's Twilight is quite good. Alright, Silver Scrutiny. This is a very powerful card. It's being used in conjunction sometimes with Mind Splice Apparatus, but you don't need it just in that context. Casting it where X is 3 at instant speed, so for 5. For 5 at instant speed, this is very powerful. Also, you can do this at sorcery speed to completely refill your hand on a stalled board. Right? You can break a situation of parity where you're not under too much pressure. Could also help you combo off by finding your combo pieces. This is overall just a very strong contender. Memory Deluge and Silver Scrutiny kind of are jockeying for position of the better card draw spell that's rare for blue. Which one is better in your deck? I can't say for sure, and maybe you should run both. Maybe you should run a little bit of both. If you run a little bit of both, then Katose the Silent Spider can't nab all of them out of your graveyard and deck. And if you've diversified your card draw that way. Since I just talked about Silver Scrutiny, I'm going to jump ahead here a moment to even the score. Probably no one remembers this card exists. This is 3 blue and X. It's a mythic instant. You draw X cards, and it costs 3 blue less to cast if an opponent has drawn 4 or more cards this turn. So the 4 or more cards thing probably basically never happens. But the reason I'm going to bring this up here is this is always instant speed, right? So if you like Silver Scrutiny, and if you like Mind Splice Apparatus, the always instant speed quality of this card means that if you have got a Mind Splice apparatus or two and you've proliferated counters onto it, then at the end of your opponent's turn, you could draw an absurd number of cards, 10, 20, whatever, and not have to discard them until the end of your next turn. And in the meantime, you may have found all the things you need to combo off to win the game. Silver Scrutiny is also great in that deck, but to do more than 3, you have to do it at sorcery speed. That's not the worst, and Silver Scrutiny is only double blue, where this is triple blue. But I think there are some situations where even the score could, maybe, be the card you're looking for there. Downside, it's a mythic, and it's going to rotate sooner than Silver Scrutiny does. So bear that in mind. Ether Channeler. I don't see this card very often. It's good, though. It harkens back to what feels like an older time of Magic, where blue tempo decks tended to run more creatures and fewer spells. And they would run creatures like Mana War. It's a 2/2 for 3, bounces a creature. Ether Channeler can do this effect as well, but it also has the modality of making a 1/1 bird or drawing a card. So, against aggro, you might make the bird, so you have 2 blockers. Trade away some of your creatures with some of theirs. Against control, you might draw a card. You might also choose to make the bird to pressure a control player, depending on how aggressive your deck is. And returning a non-land permanent, that's the kind of Mana War mode on Ether Channeler. It's also very good. If you've been getting an aggressive start, maybe you've got a ninja deck, maybe you're just an old-fashioned blue tempo deck, play the Ether Channeler, bounce their thing, get in there. See if you can tempo them out before the game ends. Overall, I like this card. Any card like this where it can go in a variety of decks, wear a lot of different hats, it appeals to me. And I think it will do good work for you, if you choose to find a way to unlock its potential. Alright, Geralf. Geralf? I'm going to go with Geralf. Visionary Stitcher. So, this is a 1/4 for 3. Zombies you control have flying. Taps to sacrifice a non-token creature. That's right, you can't sack your token creatures with them. Create an XX blue zombie, where X is the sacrifice creature's toughness. So, I would like to remind everyone again that dies to removal is not a valid criticism of a card. Not a valid criticism. Geralf can solidify your board presence against aggro. Aggro player, like let's say red, if they don't have one of their Sholdred answers in their hand, most of what they have is probably going to be play with fire or 3 damage for 2. Those aren't good enough. Now if you block with Geralf and then they use their spell, they can kill him that way, but they've lost a lot of their tempo in the process. Right, that's damage that you did not take to your face. So it's not necessarily the worst thing to block with Geralf against an aggro deck. But if you have a couple of creatures out already, choose not to block, get to untap with him. Now, at instant speed, your non-token creatures can turn into other creatures. And this is a nightmare for any deck that's trying to remove your blockers, or any deck that's just got a lot of spot removal in it. Any deck full of spot removal does not want to see that effect. Now granted, if they're full of spot removal, they can probably find a way to deal with Geralf. But again, Dice to removal is not a valid criticism. This card can win the whole game by itself by taking your other creatures, and anytime they would die, you recycle them into something else. An XX blue zombie token. High toughness creatures are better for this effect, but really, any creature will do. I believe Geralf is a very powerful card and worthy of consideration, especially if you want to brew some interesting decks. That is what this guide is all about. Puppet Stitcher never quite found its footing in Standard. Never quite comboed off, never quite found its deck. Its time in Standard is not over yet, though. There are some interesting decks that are comboing off with things like Mind Splice Apparatus, playing a lot of spells all in a row. If that becomes a thing, right, if sort of storm decks without storm cards become a thing in Standard, Puppet Stitcher could be the win condition. Or, a win condition in a deck like that. I think this card still has potential, especially for brewing with. So, it's an interesting choice of Mythic that you can go with. Alright, Skystrike Officer. I opened a bunch of booster packs of the Brothers' War, and between that and maybe some jump-in rares, I ended up getting 4 copies of Skystrike Officer, so I'll probably make a soldier deck soon, because I have the tools for it. This is a very powerful card. If you want to make a soldier deck, well, first of all, this card can run away with the game on its own. It keeps making more creatures every time it attacks, and the creatures that it makes, it can tap to draw cards. But once you give it a little bit of support, synergy with your deck, you start, running downhill towards the opponent. And it can help you recover from a board wipe. If you have some untapped soldiers, just tap them, draw cards in response to the board wipe. Now you get to untap on your next turn and keep going. This is a great card in the soldier deck, and kind of not a bad card in general. I haven't seen other decks try to use it yet, but I could imagine an Aristocrats deck or an Artifact Synergy deck, because it is a soldier artifact that it makes. So, Aristocrats, Artifacts, there might be decks other than just soldiers this card could go into. So, if you want to craft 1 to 4 of these, it's a good solid card. Haughty Jin, you might be aware of this one already. We've talked about it some here. So the budget blue tempo deck. Some people call it control. Really and truly, it's a tempo deck. It's not trying to counter all of the spells that ever exist in the game. It's trying to counter all of the early mid-game spells of the game, protect its threats, and kill you with these high-power creatures before you can deal with the situation. That's tempo. Hai Jin is very powerful. Its power just shoots through the roof as your graveyard fills up with instants and sorceries. And making instants and sorceries 1 less to cast means that on turn 4, if you have 4 islands, you play this, now you have 2 mana effectively open for an instant or sorcery. There are many cards you could protect it with. Most of which we talked about in the commons and uncommons. Right, you could phase it out, you could bounce it back to your hand, make it hexproof. You could even blink it. All of that exists in the blue uncommons and commons. You don't want to fill up your entire deck with those effects, but you want some of them. Sometimes they're better than a counterspell in this deck. So if you're doing that deck, Jump In can get you copies of the Haughty Djinn. I think it's the Arcanist's packet, but look that up before you commit. And if you don't play enough Jump In to see that, or you choose not to go past the 5 free tickets of Jump In, and you don't get Haughty Djinns, you still might consider crafting 1 to 4 of these for that deck. It doesn't go in a great variety of decks, but it's very powerful. All the other cards that go in are kind of budget options. So, even score, we talked about this one. Mind Splice Apparatus. I'm not going to recommend that you craft this one yet, but it's got a lot of potential. Comes in with Flash, so you get to keep your mana open in case you need to counterspell something or, remove something. Like if you're blue-black, blue-red, you can use your red or black card to deal with the opponent's board. If you don't need it, you get down the Mind Splice Apparatus. I've seen Covert Go Blue do some silly things with this card already. If you feel like walking down that path and trying to create sort of a combo deck of sorts, like a Storm deck, then go ahead. But I'm not certain about it yet, and I'm not going to recommend crafting it yet. Mirror Hall Mimic, I happen to have a copy of this. I'm not going to recommend you craft this one either, but I will say this is one of my favorite clones that exists in Standard right now. There is an uncommon clone, I believe it's an artifact creature from the Brothers' War, that kind of sets the power and toughness of the clone. You might look at that card instead as a budget option. Mirror Hall Mimic being able to come down as a copy of any creature and then have additional value on its backside as an aura, where it can keep making token copies of a creature you enchant. Which, if you really want to take a big risk with the Ghastly Mimicry on its backside, you could put it on an opponent's creature. That's a big risk. But you could do it. And if it worked out, it could be a hilarious win condition. Anyway, just because it has this front side and back side to it, it's kind of my favorite clone effect in Standard. If you feel like brewing around with clones, this one will do you well. Jace, the Perfected Mind. This is a mythic. It does protect itself well, does draw you cards. You can use it for your own graveyard strategy. If you know that the opponent kind of has the front foot on tempo, you don't want to help them with their mill, you can mill yourself instead. In a long game, Jace is a win condition. This comes up more often than you'd think. Control mirrors, very often I see them get down into the range of 20 cards or less left in the library. And one Jace by itself does 15 cards for 4 mana when it first enters the battlefield. If you plus it a couple of times, that quickly gets out of hand, right? At 7 loyalty, it becomes 21 cards as a mill. And in multiples, Jace can easily be a win condition that wins you the game, right? 2 copies of Jace. I've seen it with Covert Go Blue. He's able to mill people out pretty often with a pop of 30 cards from 2 Jaces. So with all of that in mind, it's not just a mill card. It can, delay the opponent's creatures, take damage away from your face as their creatures try to attack Jace to deal with it. Source of card draw. Because it's a fairly flexible card and a win condition, I think it's worth paying attention to. I'm not for sure if you should craft it, but I think it's good. It's going to be in standard for a long, long time. Memory Deluge, talked about this one. So, can flash it back for 7. This card is solid. It's just all around entirely solid. It's proven itself many times over in the standard format as one of the better blue card draw effects for a control deck. Silver Scrutiny will be in the format for longer. It's going to... Memory Deluge will rotate sooner than Silver Scrutiny, if that's any consideration for you. They're both good. I wouldn't mind having potentially a few copies of both of them in a deck. Lear. Lear, Disciple of the Drowned, is an incredibly powerful card, giving all instants and sorceries in your graveyard flashback equal to their mana cost, meaning once you cast them that way they get exiled, like flashback. It's absurdly powerful. There are so many ways to build around Lear. Now, Lear can protect himself in some of the same ways that we were talking about with tempo decks. You know, bounce him, phase him out, etc. Now, Lear does say spells can't be countered. You can bounce Lear back to your hand and then counter a spell. But overall, I would say that Lear might go better into either a tap-out kind of control strategy or a more proactive kind of control strategy, where you want to be casting instants and even sorceries. Overall, this card is amazing, completely fantastic. If I didn't already have a copy or two of this, I would definitely craft one. It's just that powerful. As it is, I do already have Lear, though. Maybe you do, too. But if you do, then don't forget that he's there and that you can use him. Teferi, Temporal Pilgrim. This is an extremely powerful planeswalker. One of the play patterns you often see with Teferi is the 0 to draw a card. He gets loyalty counters whenever you draw a card, which is kind of ridiculous. People do this to protect his loyalty when he first enters the battlefield, so maybe the opponent can't attack him down. Then after this, they play some card draw spells, and they might start doing -2 for the rest of the game. His -2 is kind of only like a -1, because you draw at least one card every turn. If you draw more than that, he can keep making these spirit tokens every turn, and those spirit tokens start growing. Potentially even faster than one counter a turn if you're drawing cards. The way this can snowball and just run away with the entire game is amazing. Crafting a copy, I don't think you'll be sad about it. Arcane Proxy. This card has not really found its home in Standard yet. It's going to be in Standard for a long time, though. Because it does not have Flash, does not work particularly well with counter spells. So you might try a more proactive or even sorcery-based approach to use the Arcane Proxy. Since it can come down as either a 3-mana 2/1, that can be very good against aggro, right? You play this as a 2/1 for 3, and then you also get a removal spell for 2 mana out of your graveyard, cast it without paying its mana cost. So you 2-for-1 the opponent there. Whether they use a removal spell on the proxy, whether it trades in combat, you've gotten a good deal at the 3-mana mark. At 7 mana, there might be some interesting combo potential that this can do. And this is an enters the battlefield trigger. I would just like to point out one of the commons we looked at has a flicker effect. I believe it's called Planar Incision. Even puts a +1 counter on the creature when it returns. when it returns, this would not be a prototype, so if you flicker, the 3-mana Arcane Proxy would come back as a 5-power Arcane Proxy. Just putting that out there. Interesting interaction. Anyway. Might be worth your time. Right, one with the multiverse. If you did the white crafting guide with me, we went ahead and crafted Repair and Recharge. It doesn't just do artifacts or planeswalkers, it also does enchantments. And by far one of the best enchantments to get back right now in Standard is one with the multiverse. It lets you use the top of your library to play cards and cast spells, and also you get one free spell every turn without paying its mana cost. These get silly in multiples. If you have other one with the multiverse in your hand, play the second one for free off the first one. Now you can play a spell for free off the second one, etc. So they could all charge onto the battlefield on the same turn if you have them all in your hand. It's silly, it's fun. Worth considering. Alright, so I have just a handful of rares and mythics, and I still need to get through all the monocolors and then multicolor. I want to save a couple of rares for the multicolor when I get to the end, and one mythic. So I'm just going to do one rare and one mythic from blue that I think are the top-notch choices here, and my choices might surprise you. So for the rare, there are many great options, but I want effects that are somewhat unique, that can't really be duplicated with lower rarity cards. So as good as these card draw spells are, you got other options. There are common and uncommon card draw spells that are very, very good. So you can do budget with your card drawing. A couple of effects I think cannot be easily duplicated are Blue Sun's Twilight and Geralf, Visionary Stitcher. These are both cards which can win you the game. Blue Sun's Twilight, if you steal a creature and then make a copy of it, that can easily win you the game. You know, steal their Phyrexian Obliterator, make another copy of it. That's hard to deal with. Steal their Titan of Industry, make a copy of it. Horrific. Geralf, I think, is a card that has not seen the potential, hasn't unlocked what it can do in Standard. People have not used it, or if they have, it didn't work for them. I'm very interested to brew around this card as a potential win condition. It doesn't just have to be in an Aristocrats build. It obviously works very well there. But I think Geralf, any deck that has some non-token creatures, Geralf can do good work for. In a similar way that Skrelv, the new 1-mana white might, can protect your creatures. Geralf perhaps isn't as good as that might at protecting your creatures, right? It costs more mana. His ability can't be done with pay 2 life. But there are some effects where the sacrifice and the new creature might be better. There might be some situations where it's better, preferable. And it's kind of comparing apples and oranges, I guess. Anyway. So Geralf is my choice. Alright. Geralf, Visionary Stitcher. I am choosing you because I'm interested in brewing around you. And I think that you have the potential to be that good. Rare wild card spent. I understand if you choose not to follow me on that craft. Alright, so for the mythics. Surge Engine, Spectral Adversary. Spectral Adversary does feel a little bit special with its phase-out ability. Surge Engine feels like we could replace it with some common or uncommon possibilities. Poppet Stitcher is interesting. I have some copies of this on my other account, so if I choose to brew with the Poppet Stitcher, I'll go over there. I'm not going to spend it on this account. Even the Score, I think it's a little bit niche. If the Mind Splice Apparatus deck becomes the thing, then even the Scorer might become a thing. New Jace, very good. Not totally convinced yet, but I think it's very good. Mill is a interesting, kind of offbeat way to win the game. Lear I already have, I think, 2 copies of. I'm not going to bother crafting more, he's legendary. Don't work that well in multiples, you're exiling spells as you use them. Teferi, very much in the running. Arcane Proxy is an interesting card, hasn't quite proven itself yet. One with the multiverse. Might not be a great number of decks to do this with. It pretty much is limited to Ramp and Reanimator. So, if you know you like Ramp and Reanimator, this is a good choice. For me, I think the strongest, most widely applicable mythic rare here is Teferi. I've sat across from it and seen it just run away with the game, many's a time. So, Teferi, Temporal Pilgrim. I choose you from among many powerful options. Alright, that brings us to the end of Blue. So, if I've brought you some value or interest today, you can like and subscribe to my channel, helps me out. And until next time, stay cool.